Welcome to Cuppa GAO. This is your coffee break with our experts where we take the time to sit down and answer your questions. Sorry we got off to a little bit of a late start, but thanks everybody who's tuning in and joining us. My name is Sarah Kazmarek, and I'm here today with Chris Currie, a director in our Homeland Security and Justice team. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone for watching.
Yeah, thanks so much for everybody who's tuning in. Be sure to like and share this live video. And we're going to be talking today about natural disasters and how the government has responded to these disasters. Before we get into this topic, Chris, could you tell me a little bit just about your work here at GAO?
Absolutely. So here at GAO, my teams and I, we evaluate federal programs for responding to, recovering from, and also preparing for disasters like the hurricanes that recently hit.
And you have done a lot of work on disaster preparedness and responding to disasters. Tell me a little bit more just about that body of work that you've done.
Absolutely. So we have looked at, like I said, preparedness, response, and recovery, and made a number of recommendations to federal agencies for how to improve those. So a good example of that would be, how do we better oversee the billions in contracts that we provide? How do we better prepare our federal workforce? And how do we provide better and quicker assistance to individuals?
Now, you already started to mention hurricanes, and we've seen 3 major hurricanes hit the U.S. so far. There's also been wildfires out in California. How is the federal government responding to these natural disasters and getting people the help and the aid that they need?
Well, there's really 2 buckets of help that the federal government provides. The first is direct help. So think about things like Coast Guard search and rescue and DOD and military delivering supplies. The other part, though, that I think most folks don't understand as well is all the financial assistance that the federal government provides, not just to individuals, but also to state and local governments to rebuild infrastructure, things like schools, water treatment facilities, and the like.
We're going to unpack a lot of that, and I also want to make sure that we get to your questions as well. So as you're watching, and if you have questions, please do type in your questions in the comment box to the live video. We're using the hashtag today, CuppaGAO, so be sure to send us your questions, your comments, use the hashtag, and also don't forget to share and like the video. Again, we're here in GAO's cafeteria doing Cuppa GAO. It's a coffee break that we do with our experts. I'm here with Chris Currie today, and we are talking about how the government has responded to natural disasters. So, Chris, you were mentioning some types of aid that the government provides. Tell me about aid that goes to individuals impacted by disasters.
Sure. Well, there's a whole suite of programs, and FEMA provides most of those. So right after a disaster hits, people can apply if they've been affected for what's called individual assistance. So that's basically to help people just get back on their feet. So that's things like rental assistance, or to repair a damaged car or replace a damaged car, just things they need to get help in the months after a disaster. But there's also longer-term loan programs that are provided to help rebuild folks' houses and things like that.
So how does somebody go about getting that assistance if they need it? If they've been impacted by a hurricane or a wildfire, what steps can they take?
Well, the most important thing is that if you're affected by it is to go to disasterassistance.gov, and that is a FEMA website, but it basically brings together all of the federal programs. So for example, not just the FEMA programs, but the Small Business Administration provides loans to homeowners and businesses, and there's information about flood insurance programs and things like that.
So you mentioned FEMA, and I know that that's an agency that has, of course, a really big role in how the government responds to natural disasters, but what other agencies are involved in this?
That's a great question, because that's often not as well understood. So another major player is the Department of Defense, obviously the military. And they have a huge role in responding to these types of catastrophic disasters because they have the equipment and the people to get things where they need to go, such as in Puerto Rico. But almost every agency in the federal government's involved. The Environmental Protection Agency gets involved if there are chemical spills, like what happened after Houston. But also Health and Human Services to provide medical care, things like that.
All right. So again, we're doing Cuppa GAO. This is your coffee break with our experts. We're talking today about natural disasters and how the government can respond to hurricanes or wildfires. We're in GAO's cafeteria having coffee. this is your chance to join us and ask us questions. Please feel free to send us your questions and comments just right in the comment box on Facebook Live. And for all 40 of you who have joined us so far, thank you so much. And be sure to like and share this video as you're joining. A question that I want to pose to you, Chris, as we're talking about this is, how much money has the government spent so far in responding to the disasters that we've seen recently?
So it's hard to know exactly because we don't yet even know what all the damage is going to be from Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria. But it's safe to say the government has already spent several $billions providing assistance both to individuals but also to state and local governments. So just to give you a sense, after Katrina, the government spent almost $100 billion, and I think between these three storms, it's well going to eclipse that. But it often takes a lot of time for those costs to be borne out, many, many years.
We've got our first few questions here from our audience. Thanks again for everybody sending in questions. Our first question is, how has all the hurricanes affected FEMA?
So, great question. Bottom line is they are stretched very thin right now, and they are actually hiring thousands of temporary employees to try to fix that issue. They are utilizing other federal agencies and other federal staff. This is actually one of the few times that FEMA has actually brought in other employees from the Department of Homeland Security, other volunteers to actually help them respond to the disaster. So these three parallel storms is a really unique thing.
Okay, just because of the scope and
Absolutely.
also...
There's just not enough bodies to do all the work.
Okay. And how is the money that's being spent being appropriated? How is Congress doing more appropriations, or is the money already in place and then being allocated? How does that work?
Sure. Well, every year Congress budgets and provides funding for disaster relief. But in a case like this where you have a catastrophic storm or several catastrophic storms, it's nowhere near enough to cover. So Congress provides additional funding, or what we call supplemental funding. They've already provided one supplemental funding package. It's about $15 billion. Actually, the Senate was taking up another one today.
Okay. Wow. Just to cover the scope of responding to all the disasters and the destruction. Okay. We have another question here from Denise. Are agencies committed to opening high-value data to track recovery and align recovery efforts? And is there anyone coordinating open data efforts across agencies to plan a more complete picture over time?
That's a great question. So actually, if you go to FEMA's website, fema.gov, they compile a lot of data and information historically by state and then by jurisdiction for how many disasters have been federally declared and how much federal funding has been provided. I think what gets more difficult is trying to figure out the total cost for disasters, both private citizen cost, insurance cost, state and local government cost, and the federal cost. I'm not aware of anything that brings all of that information together. So it's just very difficult to come up with a complete cost picture for something as large as these hurricanes.
Because if you're a homeowner in an area that's been affected by one of these hurricanes, for example, you might be putting some of your own money into rebuilding or insurance money, but then there's also the money that the federal government is spending.
Absolutely, and that's been a major challenge that we've pointed out too, is that, for everyday citizens and even state and local officials, they're trying to navigate all these different federal programs and the rules and regulations, and the money comes in at different times. Very confusing, and they're doing this when they're trying to get back on their feet after having their homes destroyed. So it's a huge challenge.
Well, Denise, thank you so much for that question, and thanks to all of our viewers who have tuned in. As you're watching, again, please be sure to share this video with especially others who you think might be interested in this topic, and also like the video. Again, we're here doing Cuppa GAO. It's coffee with our experts. I'm Sarah Kazmarek. I'm here with Chris Currie, a director in our Homeland Security and Justice team. And we're talking about how the federal government is responding to natural disasters like hurricanes or wildfires. As you have questions, please do send them in to us using the comment box. And we're also using the hashtag today, Cuppa GAO. I see a couple more questions that have come in. We have one from Joe. Does the government play a role in rebuilding in a resilient way? That's
a great question, Joe. Absolutely. There are a number of different federal funding streams that are supposed to go to rebuilding in a resilient way. We call that mitigation. So you're mitigating against future risk. One of the challenges we've seen, though, and we've made a number of recommendations, is a lot of these programs are not designed to all work together to make sure we're mitigating our biggest risks. So, for example, after large storms, large pieces of public infrastructure like wastewater treatment facilities are damaged. These are hundreds of millions of dollar facilities. And so it's very important that if we're going to rebuild those damaged facilities, that we do so in a way to where they're not going to flood again or they're not going to be damaged again. But the federal government plays a role in that. But we have a long way to go, I think, to really be where we need to be on that.
Well, and our next question comes from Leslie, who says, in the past, news stories have documented lots of waste, fraud, and abuse. And can you talk about how FEMA and other agencies are beefing up their anti-fraud efforts to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent wisely?
Sure. Well, based on the work that we've done at GAO, we've actually seen progress over time. For example, after Hurricane Sandy, we saw huge progress in the improper payment rates compared to after we saw in Katrina, which were upwards of 20%. I think they were down around 3 to 5% in Hurricane Sandy. So technology has really helped about how we gather information and how FEMA is able to vet applicants to make sure that, for example, they're not applying for assistance and they really live in Washington State when they're applying for a disaster that hit Texas. But having said that, the point is a great one. Especially with contracts, federal contracts, there's so much money. There's already been a couple $2 billion sent out in federal contracts for the 3 hurricanes. And it's very important that FEMA has the people to oversee those contracts. And that's been a challenge in the past.
So, and you mentioned once before that just because of the scope of the hurricanes and what we've seen this year, that has also just had a really big impact on FEMA. Can you talk a little bit more about how that's impacting the work that FEMA is doing?
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that the biggest challenge right now for FEMA is having the right number of people helping these different jurisdictions recover and having the right skill sets. And that's been a huge challenge. As you can imagine, within FEMA's employee group, they need people with all sorts of different skill sets to help folks. They need public affairs specialists. They need engineers. They need all sorts of people. So making sure you have the right mix in each disaster location is a huge challenge, and that's actually why they're hiring so many people to try to respond to these 3 storms.
And how is FEMA or other government agencies helping to support state and local governments or working with them as they respond to all the disasters that we've seen?
Sure. So on the response side, right after an event like a hurricane happens, and even before so, there's a lot of work and planning with the locality or the state. Afterwards, there's a number of things FEMA does. They provide urban search and rescue teams to help people get out of their houses if they're flooded. They provide logistical support, getting commodities, food, water where it needs to go. But on the recovery side, it's really money. That's really the big thing. Money to help them rebuild local infrastructure, money to help citizens get back on their feet and get their homes repaired. And so it's really a direct assistance and money.
So, again, for those of you who are tuning in and joining, we are doing Cuppa GAO. This is your coffee break with our experts. I'm Sarah Kazmarek. We're here in GAO's cafeteria. I'm here with Chris Currie, a director in our Homeland Security and Justice team, who does a lot of work on how the government prepares for and responds to natural disasters. So, as you're watching, please be sure to send us your comments, your questions. We definitely want to be sure that we answer those for you. I see one just came in from Juan, so we'll jump to that. Thank you, Juan. And Juan would like to know, has FEMA reported on the funding it committed and the plans to commit in each place affected by the hurricanes?
Well, thanks for the question, Juan. So, yes, actually, you can go to FEMA's website right now, and you can search by hurricane and by state, and you can see how much funding they have provided to each state.
And I'm going to turn next to a question from Patty. We got a few in all at once there, so thank you guys for sending in your questions. Keep them coming. Patty would like to know, what is the agency's role in emergency preparedness process? Great
question, Patty. So actually, that is one of the biggest areas we've seen of progress since Hurricane Katrina, is that FEMA has, Congress has given FEMA the lead role for preparedness across all of government. So even before an event like this makes landfall, FEMA often declares an emergency, as does the state, and they're able to go in ahead of time, set up people and infrastructure and start planning for this, and also task other federal agencies with certain response efforts even before it happens. So And that's really been the biggest change since Katrina. Rather than being reactive, it's very, very proactive.
Okay. And I'm going to get to a few more questions that we've gotten in here. I also want to remind folks, please be sure to share this live video. We want to make sure to get the word out, get lots of people a chance to tune in and ask their questions. I'm Sarah again. This is Chris. We're talking about how the government's been responding to natural disasters. I want to go to our next question from Shannon. And Shannon would like to know about needing money to rebuild, but coming back stronger and safer. What would you say about that?
Well, I think absolutely. Shannon's making the point that we need to use our federal funding and all of our funding to not just rebuild the way it was, but rebuild so we can be stronger. You know, many of these areas that have been hit by these hurricanes are clearly going to be hit again, with Texas, Florida, and certainly Puerto Rico. So actually, this is a major point that we've been making in a lot of our work, and as we talk to the folks in Congress, is that we have to be directing our dollars post-disaster to rebuilding in a resilient way, so we're not rebuilding this years down the road again.
Okay. And have you seen progress in that?
We have seen a lot more focus on trying to use the money that way. The problem is that a lot of the federal programs were just not designed to rebuild for resilient purposes, and then were not designed to come together and do it together. They have different regulations, different time frames. And it just makes it very difficult, particularly after a storm hits. And it's pretty crazy to make that happen.
Okay. So I want to go to another question from Denise. Thanks again for sending this in. She says, having gone through Katrina and New Orleans as a resident and later as an employee in local government, I know the bureaucracy from personal assistance and also assistance for local government can be crippling. Any efforts to improve the delivery of these services to local governments or to people on the ground?
Absolutely. I think what she is referring to is the regulations and the challenges of providing the funding from the federal level to the state and local governments. Because often how this works is that FEMA provides funding to the state and local governments, and then it's up to them how they want to spend it. And so what gets created, especially in an area, a populated area with multiple jurisdictions, is a lot of different things are going on differently in different places. And I think that's very confusing for people because they may see decisions being made 3 counties over and they're being made differently 2 counties over. So absolutely, I can see how it can look very inconsistent.
So I just want to remind folks, we are here in GAO's cafeteria doing Cuppa GAO, coffee with our experts. I'm Sarah Kazmarek. I'm here with Chris Currie, a director in our Homeland Security and Justice team. We're talking today about how the government is responding to and preparing for natural disasters. Thanks for all the questions that have been coming in. We're going to keep getting to your questions and comments, and also be sure to like and share this video as we spread the word about this. And Chris, I want to ask you kind of a different question. GAO has sort of a different role in the government. We're not providing the response to disasters. So how would you explain GAO's oversight role here?
Absolutely. Well, in short, what we do is we go in and we provide independent oversight for Congress. So in the cases like this, it's very important because, as you've seen, there are a lot of differing news stories and a lot of information out there about how the federal government is responding. And so what we do is we go in and we talk to all the officials, we gather data and information, and we make an independent assessment. And I will say that does take a little bit of time. We are still taking in and digesting all the information from these 3 hurricanes, and I think it will be some time before we actually can make an assessment of where the gaps were and what challenges there are.
So I do have a question actually kind of getting to that part that's challenging now that we have here about how the government could improve its response to Puerto Rico. And so first, can you just paint a picture for us about what the government has been doing to respond to Puerto Rico, and then any areas that you see there that they could potentially be improving upon? Sure,
absolutely. Well, there is no doubt that it has taken much longer to respond to the situation in Puerto Rico as opposed to what you saw in Texas after Hurricane Harvey or in Florida after Hurricane Irma. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I will say, we are still assessing the overall response. It's very, very difficult, particularly with the lack of communications on the island, to really get a full picture of what's happening at any given time. There's been a lot of news stories, and they've talked to a lot of people. But it's going to take some time to figure that out. But essentially, the federal government is what is doing what it does in all disasters. It's providing resources, it's providing search and rescue assistance, it's providing coordination on the ground, and logistical support, trying to get food and water where it's needed. And then ultimately, it's going to provide assistance to rebuild public infrastructure that's been damaged, and also provide individual assistance to citizens. And so that's something I'm not sure folks understand too, is that the citizens that live in the territories are actually eligible, as are the governments, for the same assistance as any state in the continental U.S. would be.
So if folks wanted to know more about GAO's work in this area, in addition to the other government agencies' work, you mentioned some websites specific to FEMA. Where can people go to find out more just about what GAO is doing? Sure.
I mean, the best place to go is www.gao.gov, and we have all sorts of search options for our reports. You can type in disaster assistance, emergency response, emergency preparedness, and you'll get a pretty good list of all of our reports.
And we are also looking to soon put out even more information on disaster assistance and really make our work readily available. That's part of why we're here today also, so that we can be talking with our expert on the topic, Chris Currie, about questions that you have on how the government is responding to natural disasters like hurricanes and wildfires, or preparing for them as well. So for all of you tuning in, thanks so much for doing that. Again, if you want to like and share this video, we have a couple more questions here. We'll definitely take some more. We're using the hashtag CuppaGAO today. So please be sure to like, share the video. I'm going to go back to a question that we got a little bit ago from Joe. Joe said, I understand the federal government should help with immediate cleanup. For rebuilding, why can't private insurance pay for rebuilding from natural disasters? If this hadn't happened, wouldn't private insurers require more resilient rebuilding?
That is a fantastic point, and it's a major issue with disaster assistance, and one of the reasons that the federal government provides so much in assistance. In short, Joe, the risk is too high for private insurers to pay. No insurance company would want to take out a policy to cover anywhere in the state of Texas or Florida or Puerto Rico to storm damage. And we see in these catastrophic disasters, the payouts are just so incredibly high. You know, like I mentioned before, in Hurricane Katrina, the federal government providing well over $100 billion in assistance. So the bottom line is that private insurance just does not want to take on the risk. They can't afford it.
Well, and while we're talking about insurance, I also want to ask you about flood insurance. So if you're a homeowner, do you need to have flood insurance in one of these areas? Or if you don't have flood insurance, what's that going to look like for you after a hurricane hits, for example?
That's a good question, because there's been a lot of confusion about this, particularly in Texas, where a lot of folks that were flooded, they thought they were not in a high-risk flood zone, and thus they didn't have flood insurance. But the bottom line is, traditionally, in order to be required to have flood insurance, you live in a special hazard flood area or a high-risk flood area. And if you have a federally backed mortgage, you have to get flood insurance. But the problem we're having right now is that many places are not in high-hazard flood areas. We're seeing 50 inches of rain in Hurricane Harvey. We saw, I think, well over 40 inches of rain in Louisiana last year. And they're, places that we never thought would flood are flooding. So I think folks are beginning to ask themselves whether they need to have flood insurance.
All right. Well, I want to turn to another question here we have from Rick. And this gets to something we touched on a little bit earlier about Puerto Rico. And he's asking about why the response might be taking longer in Puerto Rico than in Texas or in Florida.
Okay, Rick, great question. I think the bottom line is we don't exactly know the exact reasons and what happened in the response. I mean, certainly what we saw in Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Irma is huge assistance and aid provided by neighboring states, and not just neighboring states, but states all over the country. For example, in Florida, we had a historical influx of power company trucks from all over the country to restore power, and we had power restored very, very quickly. I think it's safe to say that logistically that was just not as easy in Puerto Rico. You do have states, a lot of states, many of you have seen it on the news, providing mutual assistance. I think New Jersey Police Department and firefighters have gone down there. So states are providing that help, but it just took a while to actually deploy people. The airport was shut down for a short amount of time, so there were limited abilities to actually logistically get stuff in there. So I think absolutely the fact that it was logistically difficult was a reason.
So I'm going to turn to a question from David, and it's a little bit of a long one, so I'm going to make sure I get it right. Thank you, David, for sending this in. It often seems to take years to get hazard mitigation funding actually on the ground to do voluntary buyouts and relocation of repetitive lost properties. Have you looked at what's the average time it takes to implement these kinds of investments and what could be done to get them in faster? And is it just simply impractical for residents?
Well, actually, so David, that's a really great question. And I think a good point, it's something that we've looked at. You are right that hazard mitigation often, not only does the money take a little while to come in, because often folks are more focused on the response aspects and hazard mitigation is thought of later. But what we've found is actually that makes it more difficult to do it in the long run, because if you don't start thinking about mitigation right when you're starting to think about rebuilding, then chances are you've missed your window of opportunity. So he's absolutely right. I think we need to come up with something where we can start making decisions very early on in the rebuild after these disasters on how to start incorporating mitigation.
Okay, so for those of us who don't work in disaster assistance every day, when you say hazard mitigation, what do you mean by that?
Okay, so good question. That's a technical term. So basically what I mean is mitigation is an investment in anything that's going to buy down your risk in the future. So I'll give you a good example. You might be able to build a wall around a piece of infrastructure so it does not flood again.
Okay.
So the idea is that you make a smaller investment to avoid a much bigger investment down the road.
All right, that makes sense. And we have a comment from William that he likes the cafeteria. I'm glad you like the cafeteria. We are live from GAO's cafeteria doing Cuppa GAO Coffee with our experts. I'm Sarah Kazmarek. I'm here with Chris Currie, a director in our Homeland Security and Justice team. We're talking today about how the government is responding to natural disasters, taking your questions. We're going to take a few more here, so please be sure to keep sending in your questions, and you can also like and share this video so others can send in their questions and comments as well. I'm going to go now to a question from Joseph. How does a town or a huge city like Houston, recoup the property tax income all the way to the state level? Some feel that the city will increase taxes to make up some of the loss. Can you clear this up for those who were not affected by flooding in the home?
Good question. We were actually just in Houston and Harris County a couple weeks ago talking to officials about these issues. And it's a great point. I think that is something very difficult for states and localities to consider, especially with buyouts. And when he says buyouts, what he's referring to is that if you have a neighborhood or a particular area of a city or a county that has been flooded, especially multiple times, the question is, should you just buy out those homeowners and return the land to nature so it doesn't flood again? You're not having to repair it. But absolutely, I think that's one of the many challenges that cities and counties have in deciding whether they want buyouts, because if they buy people out, they may leave the jurisdiction and they no longer have the tax revenue.
So let me turn to a question we have from Joe. Does federal emergency aid funding give people incentives to live in riskier places than maybe they wouldn't live in otherwise?
I think it's a fair point. Absolutely. I mean, there is no doubt that our population centers and thus our public infrastructure has gravitated towards water, towards the coast, towards lakes, towards rivers. People want to live near water. I think that absolutely, and with the federal government providing more and more disaster assistance, it definitely could incentivize that. We've also found that federal assistance also plays into the state and localities' preparedness. We issued a report a couple years ago that showed that many states don't even budget with rainy day funds for disasters. And they flat out told us it's because they know the federal government's likely going to pay for it if it's past a certain amount of money.
So looking back at that report or other recent reports that you've done on this topic, what are some of the recommendations that GAO has made in this area?
Sure. Well, we've made a number of them, but just a couple I'd like to highlight. One goes back to the discussion we had about mitigation and resilience building. I think we've made recommendations that the federal government in general needs to do a much better job of bringing all of its programs together so we're rebuilding to the areas with the highest risk in the future. And if we're going to spend all this money rebuilding, that we do it so we're not having to do it again down the road. Because ultimately, that's going to bring down the cost in the future.
Well, and I also want to make sure to ask you, taking a step back and looking at this issue and the work that you've done on it over time, what do you see as the bottom line here for folks?
Well, I think the bottom line is disasters are always going to occur, and I think many times enough time passes in between, it's almost as if we forget they can happen, and we're surprised. So I think preparedness is key for everybody involved, but certainly once something happens, the most important thing in my view is that we make it smart investments so we're not having to rebuild the same infrastructure down the road.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today on our second segment we've done on Cuppa GAO.
Thank you for having me, and thank you very much for watching.
And I also want to thank everybody who tuned in and joined us today for our segment, Cuppa GAO, Coffee with our Experts. And I really appreciate everybody who sent in their questions and comments. If you still have a question we didn't get to, or you think of one you'd like to ask us later, you can still type in questions in the comment box on the live video feed using the hashtag CuppaGAO, or you can also send us an email to opanewmedia@gao.gov. Again, thanks for taking the time to join us. We're going to be posting this live video to our timeline shortly, so when you see it there, be sure again to please like the video and share it with those that you think would find this information helpful. And be sure to please tune in and join us on our next segment of Cuppa GAO.